Welcome to the Diploma of Youth Work, CHC 50421. The Diploma of Youth Work is at a level 5, Certificate 4 is at a level 4, so the diploma requires a higher level of training work. It requires that you are able to read and analyse material and come to your own conclusions. It requires that you are now responsible for some work situations, not only able to do something in your work context, but that you can also explain that process to others and be responsible for the outcomes. It also requires that you have a language, literacy and numeracy ability that will enable you to both complete the training and carry out your own work role at this new level. The Diploma of Youth Work requires that you carry out some assessments with real clients or students, not fictitious people or scenarios, or that you can show evidence that you have done this. You'll need to do this in your residence after the training, and these are small projects that are very likely already part of your role. You'll need to get permission from your manager or your head of boarding to conduct these, and also to maintain student confidentiality. Your boarding manager is asked to assess the relevant skills, to sign off on these when they are satisfied that you are competent. On completion of the Diploma of Youth Work, you should have a very clear understanding about the role of a youth worker, the stages of development and the different constructs of youth, the range of different contexts for young people, the knowledge and skills that will enable you to meet the diverse needs of young people, and good processes for evaluating your practice, recording, reporting, and taking care of yourself, self-care. The Diploma of Youth Work is not just being competent in the assessments, but to really know and to be able to perform as a youth worker in your particular context, which is very likely the boarding residence. The first training are 2 units that are clustered together. Unit 16, develop and implement procedures to enable young people to address their needs, and Unit 18, work effectively with young people in the youth work context. So these units have been clustered together to form the introduction to the Diploma of Youth Work. You can see here the different parts of the 2 units, and these are the assessments. 18.1 has 28 questions, and we need detailed answers for these questions. P1 and P2 are projects which cover 4 units, so they cover other units as well as 16 and 18. And then there is a skills checklist which your head of boarding or boarding manager will need to fill out. Let's start with the definition of youth work. Youth work is a practice that places young people and their interests first. Youth work is a relational practice. The youth worker operates alongside the young person in their own context. Youth work is an empowering practice that advocates for and facilitates a young person's independence, participation in society, connectedness, and a realisation of their rights. And when you look at this definition of pure youth work, you might feel like this conflicts or appears to conflict with boarding practice. So if you look, for example, at this first part of the definition, youth work is a practice that places young people or a young person and their interests first, while in a boarding context or a boarding environment, you might be looking after a group of young people and the needs of the group come first while you try to meet the individual needs of each person. So it may appear that there's conflict, and you probably just need to keep that in mind as we go through, because the range of different types of youth work is very diverse. There's lots of different types of youth work. So how did this definition come about? The process was that the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition put out a consultation paper from available literature on youth work practice, and they asked the youth work sector the question, how can we demonstrate the value of youth work and the critical importance of youth workers for the development of young people and communities that will improve the perception of youth work across Australia? So they developed a working draft definition, they distributed it to the youth work sector for review and feedback, and then finally they came up with this definition of youth work. It took a long time, and it happened quite recently, probably about 20 years ago. So the context of developing this definition of youth work, the youth worker roles were being included into broader occupational roles and professions. There were occupational shortages, particularly in rural areas and remote areas, and there was a lack of career pathways for youth workers. There was the absence of a shared identity for youth workers. There is a strong sense that youth work is undervalued and that youth workers believe they'll receive limited support for resources and funding. Defining youth work was a long and difficult process because of the blurred boundaries between people who would define themselves as youth workers and all the other people who work with young people as well. So you might have a counsellor that works with young people, but they also work with adults and aged people as well. And so are they a youth worker or are they not a youth worker? They're probably not a youth worker because it's only part of what they do. The difficulty in defining what is distinctive about youth work, the very broad scope of youth with regard to the range and types of issues youth workers address, settings in which youth work takes place, levels of practice, personal values and beliefs, models, methods and approaches utilised. So you can see that this is very broad, and as we go through this unit, we'll look at different types of youth work, and of course boarding is one of those. Part of the reason why this was a long and difficult process is because actually defining youth work might actually put limitations on youth work and take away from the often spontaneous nature of the work. A lack of data and information because there'd been a period from 1999 to 2010 where the government didn't seem to support youth work. So let's look at some of these areas. Firstly, this part of the definition which says places young people and their interests first, or places a young person and their interests first. Youth workers are clear that of all the interests out there, the interests of the young people they work with will always come first. And you can probably see that there may be a conflict between a statement like that and what you do in boarding, where you've probably got other priorities as well. Youth workers also have responsibility to a large range of other people: bosses, government, communities, police, parents, organisation, funders and many others. All of these bodies have an interest in the work that youth workers do, but young people are always the primary constituent of the youth worker. Young people give youth workers consent to work with them and for them. This consent or authorisation is often informal, not often spoken. However, it creates responsibilities for the youth worker to act in their interests. A relational practice. Youth work is founded in relationships. It is a strong, respectful, trust-based relationship between youth workers and young people that allows youth workers to do their job. In their context, youth workers work alongside young people in their context, and the context includes things at all levels: the place, the culture, family, peer group, community, society. And when we talk about in their context, youth work is not limited to the individual young person, but to other people who are in that context as well. Advocates and facilitates. Youth work approach ensures that it plays a facilitation role, not viewing young people as passive recipients of the service. So it's a facilitation role. An empowering practice. If a young person is empowered, has independence and participates in society, then they're able to take control of their own experience and to make informed decisions. They can own their own destiny and they can pursue the lives they choose. They're able to participate in decisions that impact their lives. Youth workers facilitate that empowerment, independence and participation. And connectedness. Youth workers work to facilitate the connection of young people to others around them, family, community, peer groups and society, and realisation of their rights. Because of their age or social standing, young people's rights are often not protected. Youth workers work to protect the rights that young people have. Okay, let's move on and talk about youth work policy or national youth work policy. This is a sign of the government's commitment to young people. It's a practical framework for national youth development. It's an encouraging environment and opportunities for the country's young people to grow and to reach their full potential. So indicators of a national youth policy. Young people are seen as a resource, not a problem, and the indicators of a national youth policy that you'll see in the notes were established by the European Youth Forum. During Youth Week in April 2018, Australia's peak bodies for youth affairs called on the federal government to better address the needs of young people by reinstating a Minister for Youth and funding a national youth peak body. It almost seemed like the government of the day and for some time had been ignoring Australian young people. Move forward to the Albanese government of 2023. The Albanese government has re-established the Office for Youth, a dedicated unit within the government to improve policies impacting young people. It's established a youth steering committee with 15 young people on it and 5 advisory groups with 40 young people involved. The minister handling this is Dr. Anne Alley, the Minister for Early Childhood Education and also the Minister for Youth. So the Youth Steering Committee supports the establishment of the Office for Youth, supports the establishment of the new youth engagement model and advises the government. The committee consists of 15 young people aged between 13 and 24. They represent the diversity of Australian community, including First Nations people, LGBTQI+ communities, people from culturally and linguistically diverse background, and people with disabilities. So it's a very diverse group of young people. The members come from every state and territory in the Commonwealth. And then there are these 5 advisory groups: a United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties Youth Advisory Group, First Nations Youth Advisory Group, Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Youth Advisory Group, Science, Technology, Engineering and Maths, STEM Youth Advisory Group, and the Safe and Supported Youth Advisory Group. And I would encourage you in your role in boarding to look into these groups and to see if there's some way that your boarders, students in your boarding facility, can interact with these groups. We're going to look at the history of youth work in Australia, and we need to acknowledge that some practices were not acceptable today, but they were acceptable back then. And corporal punishment, of course, is one of those. And some practices were legally and morally wrong back in the history of youth work in Australia, and they are still legally and morally wrong. And we're talking about things like the sexual abuse of young people. History of youth work in Australia. Question 5 says, identify 4 different approaches to youth work over the past 200 years. So the earliest mention we can find of youth work in Australia was a focus on faith-based or religious Sunday schools in 1815. And out of that came, of course, other faith-based youth work models such as YMCA, YWCA, Anglican Home Mission, which became Anglicare, the Salvation Army and Tri-Society. Then we had another approach, and that was a social reform approach. And that involved settlement houses in different areas, generally low socio-economic areas in the cities, where young people could come together and learn different skills. They might have learned things like just table manners, or they might have learned things like cooking, etc. So they were called settlement houses, and I think there's still one of these in Australia and one in New Zealand. Then we had a focus on values, and so we had the Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, Boys Brigade, that sort of thing. Then we had this focus on fitness, and we had national fitness councils, and this was prior to and after the Second World War, and you can see there in 1941 Keep Fit book. And then we had a social justice type approach to youth work, and we had the Eureka Youth League. In the 1960s, the focus was political and social reform, and you probably remember this was a time of the Vietnam War, and they called this, in the 1960s, the New Left. The history of youth work in Australia involves professionalising the approach to youth work in the 1980s. So prior to the 1980s, there were very few university courses to train people to become youth workers, etc. The role of the youth worker was more formally recognised, and youth work training and degrees started. We also had the Community Youth Support Scheme in 1976. This was quite well funded, and it was a youth organisation, and it had a particular focus on youth work. We also had supported accommodation assistance program, and this had a specific youth component. Youth organisations included the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition 2002, and the purpose of AYAC was to represent the interests and issues of young people and the sector that supported them, so that's us, at national and international levels, offer policy advice to government and other organisations on issues that affect young people and the youth sector, to promote the well-being of young Australians, to advance the participation of young people in the community, support best practice in youth participation, take a leadership role in the youth sector, and to encourage and support coordination and cooperation in the sector. There's different groups that are involved with youth work and promoting youth work. United Nations Youth, Haligen, which is leadership for young people. This one here is Australian Multicultural Foundation, YMCA Australia, Generation Next. There's some more Generation Next material, and I would encourage you to try and hook up with some of these organisations, particularly Generation Next. And then we move on to models and types of youth work in Australia. So there's lots of different types. So we've got community youth work, we've got youth development, youth empowerment, centre-based youth work where young people are working out of a centre, base-based young youth work, so that might be working out of a church or a church youth group or a Sunday school, detached youth work, so that's not working out of a centre but just, this is sometimes referred to as street work, but detached youth work, outreach youth work, so again working in a centre and outreaching out of there, school-based youth work where you might have people going along to support young people in a school context, and so on. So you can see that that youth work is very diverse, lots of different types, and we've probably missed some out. We don't have boarding in there, for example, but youth work is very diverse. Then we have 7 models or frameworks of youth work. And so these are the different models of youth work. So asset-based community development, positive youth development, youth-led participatory action research, ecological systems theory, transformative youth work, youth empowerment model, and experiential learning. And this sounds all very academic, but I think when you look at the definitions, you'll see that it's quite easy to understand it. Asset-based community development focuses on identifying and using or leveraging the strengths, skills and resources that are already there in the community to promote positive youth development. It emphasises the active participation and involvement of young people in decision-making processes and community building activities. Asset-based community development for youth recognises that communities are rich in resources and that young people have valuable contributions to make. Positive youth development, PYD, is a strength-based approach that aims to foster the holistic development of young people by focusing on their assets, strength and potential. It involves providing opportunities for young people to develop competence, build meaningful connections, experience autonomy, and contribute to their community. The goal of positive youth development is to empower young people to reach their full potential, to become active and responsible members of society, and to make positive contributions to their communities. Youth-led participatory action research. It's a mouthful, isn't it? So we just call it YPAR. It's an approach that involves young people in conducting research about issues that directly affect their lives. It empowers young people to identify problems, gather data, analyse findings, and take action to bring about positive change in their communities. The ultimate goal of youth-led participatory action research is to generate knowledge that is relevant, meaningful, and actionable for young people and their communities. Ecological systems theory. This is developed by Yuri Bronfenbrenner. Hope I'm saying his name correctly. This theory highlights the interconnectedness between young people and their various social environments such as family, school, community and culture. It emphasises the importance of understanding and addressing the influences of these systems on young people and their development. Transformative youth work. This approach focuses on promoting social justice, empowerment and critical consciousness amongst young people. It encourages youth workers to engage in activities that challenge oppressive structures and systems and support young people in advocating for social change. Youth empowerment model. The youth empowerment model emphasises the active involvement and empowerment of young people in decision making, planning, implementation of programs and activities. It seeks to foster leadership skills, critical thinking and self-determination amongst young people. Experiential learning. This framework emphasises learning through hands-on experiences, reflection and active participation. It encourages youth workers to create opportunities for young people to engage in meaningful and practical activities that enhance their learning and personal growth. So they're the different models that we find in youth work. Next, we're going to look at the ethics of youth work, and that includes topics like the primary client, ecology, non-discrimination, empowerment, etc., and we're going to unpack those. Firstly, primary client. The primary client of the youth worker is a young person with whom they engage. Where conflict exists between the obligations to one young person and another, it's resolved in ways that avoid harm and support the young person least advantaged. Ecology. Youth workers recognise the impact of ecological forces on young people. Their work extends to the social context in which the young person lives. So that's using the word ecology to mean the relationship between a human being or between a youth worker or a young person and their environment, their social context. Non-discrimination. Youth workers' practice will be equitable and non-discriminatory. Non-corruption. Youth workers and youth agencies will not advance themselves at the expense of young people. Transparency. The relationship with the young person will be open and truthful. You'll have this level of transparency. Confidentiality. Information provided by young people will not be used against them, nor will it be shared with others who may use it against them. Knowledge. Youth workers have a responsibility to keep up to date with information, resources, knowledge and practices needed to meet their obligations to young people. Self-awareness. Youth workers are conscious of their own values and interests and approach difference in those with whom they work with respect. So if there's difference there, then they respect that difference. Self-care. Ethical youth work practice is consistent with preserving the health of youth workers, so making sure that youth workers look after themselves and practice self-care. Boundaries. The youth work relationship is a professional relationship intentionally limited to protect the young people. Youth workers will maintain the integrity of these limits, particularly with respect to sexuality. Empowerment. The youth worker seeks to enhance the power of the young person by making power relations open and clear, by holding power holders accountable, facilitating their disengagement from youth work relationships and supporting the young person in the pursuit of their legitimate claims. So I hope that makes sense. But, you know, we want to empower young people. So that's what a youth worker would do. Sometimes that means that they actually disengage from the youth work relationship because they are empowered and they can do things themselves. Cooperation. Youth workers will recognise the limits of their role. Youth workers in consultation with young people seek to cooperate with others in order to secure the best possible outcomes for young people. Now, I just want to go back and look at one of these particularly, and this is confidentiality. Information provided by the young people will not be used against them. There may be circumstances where you have to report on information provided by the young person. So particularly in situations where abuse has occurred or in situations where not reporting will impact on the well-being of the young person. So when we talk about confidentiality, we do want to be careful with information that's given to us from young people, but there may be situations where we have to report that. Becoming aware of the values of your students. This occurs as we develop effective professional relationships with young people, as we make the time to communicate with young people and hear their concerns, as we observe young people as they interact with other young people and engage with the boarding program. Sometimes we support young people consistent with their values. So you may have a student, for example, who has very strong values concerning healthy eating and not eating meat. That person could be supported by canteen options or residence menu options or making a complaint. So you can support young people consistent with their values. Let's look at the constructs of youth. Constructs is how we view young people, perceptions of young people. French historian Ayres wrote this book, Centuries of Childhood, in 1962, and it created great controversy. It was the first book that came out with a social perspective on young people rather than just biological facts, but he made claims like in medieval society the idea of childhood did not exist, and he used images like this one, paintings like this, where it shows children interacting in the same way as adults interact, dressed the same, etc. So he made claims from these sort of images. So this caused a lot of controversy. People said that's not true, but what do we know for sure? What we know was that childhood was very different for different classes. The length of childhood increased for boys. So the amount of time before a boy engaged with an adult male activity, such as work, etc., increased because they went to school for longer. And it took centuries for the length of childhood to increase for girls. In the 1700s and 1800s, childhood became commercialised, toys, books, games, etc. There was education into the early teens for boys, but for girls, their education ended at a much earlier age, and education was really only for parents who could pay. If you couldn't pay, then your child didn't access education. Australian Indigenous parents have traditional child-rearing practices. Children are very self-reliant at a younger age. They participate in adult tasks, and for most First Nations groups around Australia, there is a ceremony to go into adulthood for boys. New arrivals to Australia. Australia was a penal colony with convicts and those who were managing convicts. Settlers did start to come, and there were ticket of leave ex-convicts who were settling on land in Australia. In the 1830s, there was a view that crime in Australia resulted from a lack of education. So the government provided money for schools, for teachers, for books, and had a standardised curriculum. And you might think, well, that's what governments do, but apparently this was quite innovative for the 1830s. In the 1870s, school attendance became compulsory, but this was impossible to monitor, and many Australian young people did not go to school, and many First Nations young people were actually excluded from school. One of the constructs was controlling the nation's young men. Society wanted Australian young men who would safeguard and advance the society, and so you had these ideals of manliness and increased vigour. In the 1870s and the 1880s, there was a concern about the descent into barbarism, irreligion and vulgarity, because the Australian society was so far removed from the European civilization. And so a new construct emerged where there was suppressed masculine qualities in favour of an effeminate manliness, intellectualism, godliness and moral maturity. In the early 1900s, there were perceived threats to Australia. Remember, this was around about the Boer War. And so they wanted a different construct again of young men. They wanted tough young men who could defend the country and conquer inland Australia. The idea of manliness was gradually reworked to focus on physical strength, courage, chivalry, patriotism and military capability. So that was a changing construct of young people. Along at the same time, we had this larrikin movement. So this was general poor behaviour, fighting, drunkenness, and of course it resolved in over-policing, which led to anti-police violence and other antisocial behaviour. And so you had these larrikin belts in cities, and you also had ladettes. So larrikin generally refers to males or men, male young people, and then ladettes, who were women. Another construct of young people was that they are the unemployed. So youth unemployment is about twice as high as the general unemployment figure. And in the 1980s and 1990s, it got to 20%. And young people are often stereotyped as being young people, as being unemployed. Another construct is that young people need controlling. Young people are seen as being antisocial, out of control, in need of managing and controlling by the institutions in which they live. This construct was very dominant in Australia prior to the 1960s and 1970s, but it mellowed as Australian society changed during and after the Whitlam years. There are other constructs of young people, that they need education and moulding, they're an asset for the country, they've got innovative and worthwhile ideas. So these are different constructs of young people. The European Youth Forum said that it's important to look on young people as a resource and not a problem that needs to be resolved. A problem-oriented approach is short-term and ad hoc, and it tries to extinguish fires and solve problems. So young people should be seen as a resource with long-term solutions, identifying needs and developing policies to let young people realise their full potential as citizens. So question 18 asks for 2 ways that we can take this approach into our work context. Maybe collaborate with young people, using their cultural knowledge, their values, etc. for events such as NAIDOC Day, use a restorative approach to get ideas for solving problems, giving consequences, etc., and choosing activities. So that is about an approach where we see young people as a resource and not as a problem to be solved. Changing contexts for young people, and we want to look at these contexts: social and cultural, work and economic, political contexts. So firstly, the changing social and cultural context for young people. This has been continuously evolving over the years, and it's influenced by various factors such as technology, culture, political and global events. So technology, We're in an era of smartphones, social media, and the internet, and this has changed the way young people communicate, learn, and socialise. Social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok have become central to young people's social lives, and I'm sure that's nothing new to you. I'm not telling you anything you didn't know before. But the way young people communicate, emojis, memes, and internet slang. Diversity and inclusion. There's a greater representation of diverse groups in media, politics and workplaces, gender identity, sexual orientation and racial equality, redefining family and relationship norms. The concepts of marriage, cohabitation and parents are evolving to encompass a wider range of choices and family structures. So that's diversity and inclusion. Now, globalisation, young people are exposed to a wide range of global influences through media, travel and the internet, and advertising, shopping, fast food, etc. Note, different cultures making allowances. So this is question 20. Cultural contexts and practices will have an impact on what allowances are made and what rights are given and what responsibilities are expected. So we should respect and seek to understand these cultural differences, and there'll be situations where we need to make allowances and change expectations for rights and responsibility because of the changing culture. For example, this might be allowing more time or allowing greater flexibility in expectations. Next, we want to look at the changing work and economic context for young people. In post-war Australia, there was stability and significant growth that delivered jobs and prosperity, and it was a time of huge growth and huge immigration into Australia as well from other countries. Young people either left school for work or apprenticeships, or they stayed at school and they went on a university path. So that's what it was like in post-war Australia. However, the work and economic context for young people has been undergoing significant changes driven by technological advances, globalisation, economic shifts such as a decline in manufacturing, and we've certainly seen that in Australia, and jobs moving offshore as well as fly in, fly out. There's no certainty of employment even if a young person completes the relevant degree or training, and there's no certainty of continuing employment. Everything is based on more short-term contracts. COVID lockdowns caused more job losses for young people. So it affected young people more than older people. As the economy recovered, new jobs for young people were almost entirely part-time or casual with little job security. So 97% part-time or casual. Housing affordability is also affecting the economic context for young people, and we know that's a very big theme and a very big concern in Australia at the moment. To meet these challenges, young people in Australia are becoming adaptable, developing new ways of working, and are developing different work values. Adaptability, we're seeing continuous learning and a willingness to embrace new career paths. So a young person might be in a job, but they're training so that they make themselves available for different career paths. Young people are reshaping traditional notions of work, and they're contributing to a more dynamic and flexible employment environment. They hold options open, they respond to changing markets, and they balance working in the present with an orientation to the future, remaining of value to labour markets. So that's how young people are adapting to these changes. New ways of working include the gig economy, side hustles, remote work, and entrepreneurship. So all of those are new ways of working for young people. Changing work values. They've probably got a better life-work balance than my generation, and they're very much concerned in environmental and ethical concerns. And then we have the changing political context for young people. The views of young people in Australia regarding politics can vary widely, and it's important to recognise that there's no single perspective that represents all young Australians. But there has been disillusionment and apathy apathy for the political system. There's been a desire to change, and there's been digital engagement with this. So young people haven't always engaged with the political system in a traditional way. They are tending to do this using a digital engagement process. So how can supervisors respond to these changing contexts for young people? It's important to stay informed, build strong relationships, foster inclusivity, address mental health, stay accessible and empathetic, and do our share of professional development. Make sure we remain informed. Legal frameworks. Legal frameworks that impact young people, providing rights, protections and guidelines and develop include Convention on the Rights of the Child, education laws, youth justice system, child protection laws, employment laws, health and wellbeing laws, and youth participation laws. So these are legal frameworks that impact young people. The impact of these legal frameworks on young people: nearly half of Australian young people experience at least one legal problem in a 12-month period. Now that seems huge, but that could be something like a speeding fine, or maybe they've been charged for being drunk and disorderly, or something like that. So it does seem a lot. Half of Australian young people experiencing at least one legal problem in a 12-month period. Legal problems can impact negatively on these life areas of young people, but there are documents and websites available to give young people information and advice. Risk-taking and poor social behaviour, and this will help you with question 26. Young people are at that stage of life where they need to explore, experiment, discover, to learn and to grow, and it's all part of developing into adults. But a young person's process of brain development, the prefrontal cortex, etc., can leave them vulnerable to poor decisions and peer pressure. Social media and YouTube environment, TikTok, etc., can increase risk-taking and poor social behaviour. Some young people strive for notoriety and popularity on these platforms, and to stand out, feats need to be very risky, very dangerous or outrageous. And so some young people have quite a big following on these platforms, and so there is the possibility of significant income from that, but other young people have either been injured or have died from taking these very risky and dangerous feats. So how can we help? What can youth workers do to help? You can explain to young people how the brain develops and how it works and how this makes them prone to risk. You can help a young person develop a stop and think response to decisions that involve risk. You can provide scenarios where the response helps build less risky neural pathways, so scenarios where they have these pathways that are just less risky. Offer skill building activities, physical and creative, that can build strong pathways. So let's have a look at popular beliefs. And there's a lot of popular beliefs out there. Vaccinations can cause harm to young people. Lifelong learning is necessary for a successful life. You only use 10% of your brain. Talking on your cell phone will give you cancer. Fluoride in the water is a government conspiracy. Anybody can achieve anything if they try hard enough. And so there's a lot of these popular beliefs out there. And this can include some faith beliefs as well. So popular beliefs, how can we help young people with these? We need to work with young people to enable them to identify and check their own beliefs, and to see how these beliefs may be impacting decisions, behaviours and attitudes. And we can help them access fact-checking websites such as Snopes. Unit 1618, Part 2. There are 39 assessment questions, which are written questions, from question 29, and there's P1 and P2, which are projects that cover this unit as well as 3 other units. We want to start off by looking at boarding practice that is sustainable. So how can we make our practice sustainable in boarding? So first of all, we obviously need sufficient staff members, sufficient students, sufficient funding, and then appropriate physical resources and sufficient physical resources. We also need good and appropriate practice, because if we don't have good practice, then our boarding could be closed down or staff dismissed or removed from boarding. So how do we make it sustainable? We attract and retain staff members, attract and retain students, have sufficient funding for continued operation, and maintain industry standards and regulatory requirements. It's important to reflect on our practice and who we are. And so why is this important? So when questioned by young people, it helps us check our facts and to see if we have any bias, to see if we're judgmental, to see if we may have been affected by our backgrounds, beliefs, etc. So it is important to reflect. Next, we want to talk briefly about ethical breaches. So when responding to an ethical breach, most of us will have an ethical decision-making process which looks something like this: recognising a potential ethical breach, finding irrelevant information and gathering evidence, consulting with peers or managers, considering the best course of action, coming to a decision and making sure it's consistent with policies and procedures and legislation, and then reflecting on our decision. Sometimes this will involve mandatory reporting, and other times it's important to maybe involve another person, another appropriate person. So this could be somebody in your management or another individual who has the knowledge and skills to provide advice, because they can provide a different perspective, or they may have additional experience or knowledge that could support your action and help you think differently about your decision. And we just need to be careful with confidentiality around that. Next, we want to talk about student rights and responsibilities. So students have a right to these sort of things: a safe boarding environment, privacy, confidentiality, to be treated with respect and dignity, to have their social, cultural, physical needs met, to have informed choice, to be able to complain if they are unhappy about the service being received, and being informed about the service, etc. But it's one thing to have rights, but students also have responsibilities. So students have a right to be treated fairly and not to be discriminated against, and to be treated courteously, but their responsibility is also not to discriminate against others, to respect others, to earn respect, to be a good representative of the school, and to be courteous. And so you can see here there's student rights and student responsibilities, and it goes on here as well. So with each of these rights, there are responsibilities, and this will help you answer question 34. So that's student rights and responsibilities. Next, we want to talk about adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experience, ACEs, are potentially traumatic events that occur during childhood or age 0 to 17. These experiences have a profound and long-lasting impact on a person's physical, emotional, and mental well-being throughout their life. And so types of adverse childhood experiences, this will help you with question 35. There's physical abuse, the experience of being physically harmed or injured by a parent or a caregiver. Indicators could include visible signs of physical injury, such as bruises, burns, fractures, or unexplained injuries in different stages of healing. Emotional abuse, the experience of being subjected to verbal or emotional maltreatment, such as constant criticism, humiliation, or rejection. Indicators include low self-esteem, extreme behaviour, withdrawal, anxiety, depression, delayed emotional development, or difficulty forming healthy relationships. Sexual abuse involves any form of unwanted sexual contact or exploitation perpetrated against a child. Indicators, there are a lot of indicators, but physical indicators include difficulty in sitting or walking, torn or bloody underclothes, inappropriate sexual knowledge, or sexually transmitted infections or pregnancy in adolescence. Neglect, the failure of a parent or caregiver to provide the necessary physical, emotional, or educational needs of a child. Indicators include poor hygiene, inappropriate clothing for the weather conditions, consistent hunger, unsupervised for extended periods, and lack of medical care. Then you've got household dysfunction, so exposure to dysfunctional family dynamics such as domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness, parental separation, or incarceration. Indicators could include behavioural problems, aggression, defiance, impulsivity, hyperactivity, or conduct disorders, emotional difficulties, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, frequent mood swings, or emotional withdrawal, academic challenge, poor school performance, difficulty concentrating or learning disabilities, social difficulties, problems forming and maintaining relationships with peers, difficulty in trusting others, exhibiting antisocial behaviours, substance abuse or risk-taking behaviours, physical symptoms such as frequent headaches, stomach aches and other unexplained physical conditions, poor self-care, regression, going backwards in your development, and acting as a parent or having to act as a parent. So that's household dysfunction and all of those possible indicators. ACEs have a cumulative effect, meaning that experiencing multiple ACEs increase the risk of negative outcomes. The impact of ACEs can be apparent in various ways, including physical health problems, such as chronic disease, mental health disorders, such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, impaired social functioning, and reduced educational and employment opportunities. Understanding and addressing ACEs is crucial for promoting the well-being of students. Trauma-informed approaches and interventions that address the underlying effects of ACEs can help lessen the negative consequences and promote resilience and recovery. This includes providing support, trauma-informed therapy, access to resources, and creating a safe and nurturing environment for children and families affected by ACEs. So that is adverse childhood experiences and, the effect of adverse childhood experiences, and that will help you answer those questions. Okay, so now we're going to look at trauma. Trauma refers to psychological and emotional harm that occurs as a result of experiencing or witnessing a distressing or life-threatening event. It's a complex and individualized response to a potentially traumatic event. So it's going to be different for every young person. Trauma can have long-lasting effects on a person's mental, emotional, physical well-being, and it may impact various aspects of their life, including relationships, self-esteem, and daily functioning. It's important to approach potentially traumatic events and trauma with sensitivity and understanding. Recognizing the potential impact of these events and providing trauma-informed care can help mitigate harm and support the well-being of young people who have experienced trauma. Traumatic events can be a single incident, or it can be an ongoing situation that exceeds a person's ability to cope with or process the experience or the event. Trauma can result from a wide range of events, including natural disasters such as earthquakes, hurricanes, floods or wildfires, accidents involving serious injuries, car crashes or other traumatic incidents, violence, including physical assault, sexual assault, domestic violence or witnessing violence. Trauma can result from abuse, such as childhood abuse, emotional abuse or neglect, war or conflict, experiencing or witnessing violence, displacement or loss during armed conflicts, medical trauma, serious medical procedures, chronic illness or life-threatening medical conditions. Trauma can result from loss or bereavement, the death of a loved one, including grief and bereavement-related trauma, childhood trauma, such as we were just talking about, adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, during childhood, such as neglect, abuse, or unstable environments. So trauma can have a profound effect on an individual's mental, emotional, and physical well-being. It can disrupt their sense of safety, trust, and overall functioning. Common effects or reactions to trauma include intrusive thoughts or memories of the event, the traumatic event, flashbacks or nightmares related to the trauma event, avoidance of reminders or triggers associated with the trauma, hyperarousal, so being aroused all the time, or heightened anxiety leading to difficulties with sleep, concentration, and irritability. Common reactions to trauma include emotional and mood disturbances such as depression, anxiety, or emotional numbness, changes in behaviour or social function, including withdrawal or avoidance of certain situation, physical symptoms such as headaches, gastrointestinal problems, or chronic pain. It's important to note that individuals may respond to trauma differently, and the impact of trauma can vary depending on lots of different factors, including the person's resilience, their support systems, and their previous experience. Trauma types. Common types of trauma are acute trauma, chronic trauma, complex trauma, and developmental trauma. Acute trauma refers to a single isolated traumatic event such as a car accident, a natural disaster, or an assault. Chronic trauma occurs when an individual is exposed to repeated or prolonged traumatic events such as ongoing physical or sexual abuse, domestic violence, or war-related experiences. Complex trauma refers to exposure to multiple and varied traumatic experiences, often occurring within a caregiving or interpersonal relationship context. It's commonly associated with childhood abuse, neglect, living in an unstable or dysfunctional environment. Developmental trauma. This occurs when traumatic experiences happen during critical periods of childhood development, leading to long-lasting effects on emotional, cognitive, and social functioning. So let's look at complex trauma in a little bit more detail. Complex trauma describes a particular type of trauma that goes well beyond a one-time incident. It tends to be repeated, ongoing, difficult or impossible to escape from, often occurs within a personal relationship, often begins in childhood so that it affects a child's development, and is often covered up, kept secret, or denied. Common causes of complex trauma are childhood abuse and domestic violence. However, complex trauma is also seen amongst people who have survived imprisonment, torture, or sex trafficking. Being a refugee or being exposed to long-term conflict can also cause complex trauma. The differing effects of a single incident trauma and complex trauma. What are the different effects? Single incident and complex trauma are similar in many ways, but there are some important differences. Complex trauma has more wide-reaching effects. People with complex trauma have had more episodes of the trauma. There is additional reasons why complex trauma results in more significant problems. Single incident trauma, such as accidents or natural disasters, are much more likely to be public events. So lots of other people know about it and can share the trauma, so there's a lot more community acceptance. This can provide validation and reduces the secrecy and reduces the shame of this trauma. Single incident events usually have a clear beginning and a clear end. Once the event is over, survivors can reach a place of safety and may be able to seek help and recover. Complex trauma is ongoing, repeated frequently, and there is little time or opportunity to recover. Complex trauma often occurs in secrecy. The person is unable or afraid to talk about it and go and get help. In most cases, complex trauma begins in childhood or adolescence, and the brain is still growing. Ongoing trauma can cause changes in brain structure and functioning that can affect future development. Survivors have had their development affected. They find it more challenging to cope with everyday life and relationships that everybody else copes with. They have problems with healthy development, and this leads to chronic difficulties with emotions, concentration, memory, and having challenges in stable and safe relationships. So, they often don't have stable and safe relationships. In cases of complex trauma, people are often harmed by somebody in a position of power over them. Survivors usually feel that they've been unable to escape, and this leads to chronic feelings of helplessness. Complex trauma often occurs within a relationship that's meant to be safe. So this leaves a survivor feeling very confused. This is supposed to be a safe relationship, but this complex trauma is occurring. All humans have an innate need to attach to their caregivers and loved ones, so when a caregiver is not safe, this causes a conflict between needing to connect and needing to be safe. This conflict is not something that people, particularly children, can solve by themselves, and it can result in survivors doubting themselves and feeling unsafe when they grow close to people. Secrecy and shame are common in child abuse, sexual assault and domestic violence. Survivors often blame themselves, and they may doubt the reality and feel alone, or as if they are the only person that this has happened to. They may feel others can never understand them. When the abuse is long-term, it can affect the survivor's sense of self and identity. This means that complex trauma changes the way people think, feel and behave towards themselves. They sometimes believe that they are bad, worthless or broken. These beliefs interfere with self-confidence and with relationships. People who have had prolonged trauma and cannot escape physically learn to use mental strategies to escape. As a result, people with complex trauma may experience problems with thinking and concentration, difficulties feeling present as they go about life, lack of attention, dissociation, and problems with memory. Indicators of trauma. There are potential indicators that might suggest a young person has experienced trauma. These indicators are not definitive proof of trauma, and each individual might exhibit a combination of different signs. Additionally, trauma can manifest itself differently in many individuals. So common indicators of trauma in young people include, and this will help you with question 37, behavioural change, noticeable shifts in behaviour such as aggression, withdrawal, irritability or difficulty concentrating. They may become excessively compliant or excessively rebellious. Emotional dysregulation. So frequent mood swings, intense emotions or emotional numbness. They may feel heightened anxiety, depression, fear or anger without any apparent cause. Sleep disturbance. Nightmares, insomnia or trouble falling asleep can be indicators of trauma. They may also experience bedwetting or fear of sleeping alone. Avoidance behaviours. A young person might actively avoid situations, places or activities that remind them of the traumatic event. They may withdraw from social interactions, hobbies or activities that they once enjoyed. Hyperarousal, hypervigilance, being easily startled or a constant sense of being on edge. That's what hypervigilance is. They may display an exaggerated startle response or have difficulty concentrating due to being constantly alert. Physical symptoms. Unexplained physical complaints such as headaches, stomach aches or general malaise. These symptoms may not have a clear medical cause. Regressive behaviours, reverting to earlier developmental stages such as bedwettings, sun-sucking, baby talk, particularly if these behaviours were previously absent. Academic struggles, a decline in academic performance, difficulty concentrating, or a loss of interest in schoolwork and extracurricular activities. Social difficulties, difficulties forming and maintaining relationships with peers and authority figures. They may have trust issues, they may become overly dependent or exhibit intense separation anxieties. Flashbacks or intrusive thoughts, re-experiencing the traumatic event through vivid memories, nightmares or intrusive thoughts that cause distress. So these are all common indicators of trauma in young people. Behavioural change, emotional dysregulation, sleep disturbance, avoidance behaviours, hyperarousal, physical symptoms, regressive behaviours, academic struggles, social difficulties, flashbacks, or intrusive thoughts. With trauma, it's important to approach these indicators with empathy and to seek professional help from mental health providers or professionals who specialise in trauma if you suspect a young person may be experiencing trauma. A trained professional can conduct comprehensive assessment and provide appropriate support and treatment. What is the difference between potentially traumatic events and trauma itself as harm to the young person? Potentially traumatic events are events that have the potential to cause significant distress, fear, or harm to an individual. Examples of traumatic event include natural disasters, car accidents, violence, abuse, sudden loss of a loved one. These events have the capacity to overwhelm a young person's ability to cope and may elicit strong emotional or psychological reactions. However, not everyone exposed to a potentially traumatic event will develop trauma. And there's lots of reasons for this, why some people develop trauma from a traumatic event and other people do not. And this can include the sort of support that young people get, how resilient they are, and lots of other factors. So not everybody exposed to a potentially traumatic event will actually develop trauma. Dissociation. Types of dissociation. Dissociation exists on a spectrum, and almost everyone experiences low-level dissociation at some time. In fact, daydreaming is an example of typical and low-level dissociation. Types of dissociation include derealization, depersonalization, changes in sense of identity, memory loss, etc. So let's go back and unpack these. Derealization, feeling as though the world around you isn't real. This might mean feeling as if you're watching a movie, or if you're looking at someone else's life, or if it looks like everybody seems 2D, two-dimensional, or fake. Depersonalization, an altered sense of your thoughts, behaviours, body, or sense of self. For some people, for example, this can just include feeling numb or like you're watching from the inside of yourself. Changes in a sense of identity. You might experience changes in your personality, feel like you are two different people at once, or like you have multiple personalities. Some people are aware of these changes and some aren't. Memory loss. This is when you dissociate, it's hard to form memories or pay attention to things happening around you, which might make it hard to remember things later on. Amnesia, lost memories, are the most severe form of memory loss. Dissociative disorders. The kinds of dissociative disorders experienced, which is normally intense, distressing, and unhelpful. So dissociative disorders is a kind of dissociation which is intense, distressing, and unhelpful. So that's the definition of dissociative disorders. Dissociation is a coping mechanism that some individuals develop as a response to overwhelming or traumatic experiences. Not everyone who experiences childhood trauma will develop dissociation. A common phenomenon observed in individuals who have experienced severe or chronic trauma is dissociation. Research suggests that dissociation is more likely to occur when a traumatic event happens at an early age, or this traumatic experience is prolonged, or involves interpersonal violence or abuse. Additionally, factors such as a lack of support systems, limited resources for recovery, and the absence of a safe and stable environment contribute to the likelihood of dissociation. Types of dissociative disorders. Depersonalization, derealization disorder, dissociative amnesia are two of these. Depersonalization, derealization disorder. This is when a person feels detached from their life, thoughts, feelings, and behaviours. Other symptoms include difficulties concentrating, memory issues, feeling spaced out, like time seems to move differently, or their body is different from usual. Their hands seem bigger or seem to grow or shrink. So remember that what we're talking about here is a dissociative disorder, which is a disorder which is intense, distressing, and unhelpful. And because there are other forms of disassociation, which we do not call dissociative disorders. We talked about one of those, that's daydreaming. Dissociative amnesia, remember that we're talking about dissociative disorders. Dissociative amnesia, this is when you can't remember the details of a traumatic event, but you're realising that you are experiencing memory loss. You know the event occurred, but you can't remember it. There are multiple kinds of this sort of amnesia, including localised, so no memory of a traumatic event; selective, which means you remember bits of a traumatic event; generalised, difficulty in remembering details from your entire life; systemised, really specific memory loss, e.g. forgetting a particular person. When somebody suddenly forgets who they are and have no memory of their past, they often know they've lost their memory and might invent a new identity. Eventually, when they come out of the fugue, they forget their new identity and life. So these are the different types of amnesia. Other specified dissociative disorders and unspecified dissociative disorders are trance states that aren't part of an accepted cultural or religious practice, acute dissociation due to extremely stressful or traumatic events that lasts less than a month, so during and after a car accident, for example, identity changes caused by coercion, brainwashing or cult recruitment, and impacts on life. People with dissociative disorders are likely to experience other mental illnesses, including depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, personality disorders, trauma-related disorders, and substance abuse disorders. So that's people who have dissociative disorders. They might have other symptoms or impacts, including self-harm, thoughts of suicide, sleep difficulties, difficulties with work and study, conflict in relationship, other self-destructive behaviours such as risk-taking, treatment and coping. Treatment. So what are the treatment options for dissociative disorders? They can be treated. Seek professional support. Be very mindful of the triggers. Create a safety plan with support people. Create a sense of safety and use grounding techniques. Addressing trauma. In Australia, professionals who can address trauma and provide support and treatment to individuals who've experienced trauma include psychologists, psychiatrists, trauma-focused therapists, social workers, counsellors, and general practitioners and doctors who are GPs. Trauma-informed practice. This is an approach to service delivery that recognises and responds to the impact of trauma on individuals. It involves understanding the effects of the trauma, creating a safe and supportive environment, and providing appropriate care that promotes healing and recovery. The key principles of trauma-informed practice are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, empowerment and collaboration, cultural, historical and gender sensitivity, trauma awareness, a strength-based approach, collaboration and coordination, and have a resilience and recovery-oriented approach. So let's just unpack those a little bit. Safety means ensuring the physical and emotional safety for individuals, creating an environment where they feel secure, supported and free from re-traumatisation. Trustworthiness and transparency is building trust with individuals through clear and honest communication, providing information about the process, expectation and boundaries to foster that sense of trust and predictability. Empowerment and collaboration. This is recognising and supporting the strength and autonomy of individuals, involving them in decision making, in respecting their choices, empower them. Collaboration between service providers and individuals is emphasised, promoting a sense of empowerment and active participation in their own care. Cultural, historical and gender sensitivity, recognising and addressing the impact of cultural, historical and gender factors on individuals' experiences of trauma, incorporating cultural competence and sensitivity in service delivery to ensure that care is inclusive and responsive to diverse needs. Trauma awareness. Developing a deep understanding of the effects of trauma on individuals, including the potential for re-traumatisation. So that's what we really want to try and avoid, that in supporting a young person we can somehow re-traumatise them. Educating staff members about trauma and its impact to enhance empathy, reduce stigma and promote effective responses. Strength-based approaches. So focusing on an individual's strength, their resilience, their own resources, and recognising their capacity to heal and recover and build upon their own strengths, their existing strengths and coping strategies. Collaboration and coordination, facilitating coordination and collaboration between the different services providers and systems involved in an individual's care in a case management type approach. Promoting integrated and holistic approaches to address the complex needs of trauma survivors. Resilience and recovery oriented, recognising and promoting the inherent resilience of individuals who have experienced trauma, supporting their recovery journey by providing access to appropriate interventions, resources and support networks. Trauma-informed practice involves shifting from asking what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and it acknowledges that behaviours and reactions are often adaptive responses to traumatic experiences. Next, we want to look at assessing and responding to the needs of young people, and we do this by screening and assessment. So screening evaluates the possible presence of a particular need or condition. Assessment defines the problem and develops specific treatments or recommendations for addressing the problem. So assess and respond to the needs of young people. Screening. This can be by observation, listening, can be an interview, it can be a combination of observations and interviews, formal and informal. It can be viewing documents such as the student application, health details, reports, etc. So screening documents include student application forms, interview notes, referee interview notes, parent guardian interview notes, previous school reports, previous boarding reports, health reports. Now all of that probably would come in a student application form or documents with the student application form. You may also have incident reports from a previous school or from your own school. There may be anecdotal records, emails and other communication. So there's lots of documents that can be used for screening students. Screening and assessment, it's part of a supervisor's role to screen, and we do this all the time. You know, when a group of students come in, we are constantly screening them. We're looking for students who are uncomfortable, who are not fitting, who are silent, who seem unwell. So we're constantly screening as we supervise young people. But it's not the role of a supervisor to assess. So you need to check your residence policies and procedures here. But residential supervisors should not attempt to carry out assessment procedures, which is a diagnosis or a diagnostic procedure, because this requires a qualified and experienced professional. So while we are part of the screening process, and that's a normal part of our job, assessment is generally not part of our job. And of course, there'll be mandatory reporting requirements for reporting abuse. Screening and communication. So when you're communicating with a student during screening and assessment, the communication should be very clear and easy to understand. It should be sensitive to the cultural needs of the student. It should be reassuring and supporting. Next, we want to look at minimising the effects of aggressive and abusive behaviour when somebody's engaging with the services. So when, for example, a student is engaging with boarding. So what strategies are there to minimise the effects of aggressive and abusive behaviour? We can teach assertiveness skills, and I'm thinking here we would be teaching our staff assertiveness skills, and also students. So that's about standing up to for your rights, but doing this in a way that's respectful and courteous. Providing education on healthy boundaries, exploring coping strategies, promoting self-care, enhancing problem-solving skills. So, you know, working with young people to enhance those problem-solving skills, providing information on available services for young people, role-playing and practice scenarios, reinforcing the importance of respect, and offering support and reassurance. So these are strategies that we could use to minimise aggressive and abusive behaviour. Screening culturally diverse students. Culturally diverse students' access and equity ensure all students, all Australians enjoy full access to services that they're entitled to. That should probably be all students, because some students may be from other countries. It's not about special services for people of backgrounds, cultural and linguistic diverse backgrounds, or from a non-English speaking backgrounds. It's about identifying and removing barriers to them participating in a service that they want to utilise. It's an equitable, fair and just distribution of resources amongst all eligible students to meet their needs. Sometimes we need to screen to ensure a student is safe, and this should be a priority. A student may be in danger because they've got urgent health risks themselves. They might be diabetic, or they might have asthma or something. They're at risk of injuring themselves through self-harm or suicide, or they're at risk of injuring another person. So we screen to ensure that students are safe. Screening for indicators of sexual abuse. If we believe there are indicators of sexual abuse, we remove students from immediate danger. Now, in our context, if that sexual abuse is most likely to have occurred outside of a boarding context, so there is probably not an immediate danger, but there could be an immediate danger of the effects of that abuse. So we need to keep that in mind as well. Comply with state and territory mandatory reporting legislation, report to the appropriate person or organisation according to policy and procedures, and monitor and support students. Screening, informing the student. So when we're screening or involving students in the screening and assessment process, is this something for all students or just this student? So informing the student about that, what the results might be and how you'll communicate the results to the student, the possible impact of the results, and the support options for the student. Meeting a student's needs, seeking support. So what are the options in your school community? It could be other boarding staff members. It could be people in the school. It could be the school nurse or the boarding nurse. It could be your wellbeing team, counsellors, guidance officers, psychologists, educational psychologists, etc. Meeting a student's needs, seeking support. These are options in the local community. It's going to be things like health professionals, mental health professionals, counsellors, psychologists, psychiatrists and tutors. And obviously if your boarding facility is in a remote or it's in a country town or in a remote area, a lot of these options are going to be less available. They're not going to be as available for students. Checking existing programs to support students' needs. If we're going to use an existing program, we need to make sure that the content is culturally appropriate, that it is fit for purpose, and that we are allowed to access this material. Involving family. Involving family when addressing the needs of a young person is important, because family might have an understanding of their child's personality, strengths, weaknesses, etc. Family are going to have that understanding. Family bring a holistic perspective on their child's life, including the home environment, family dynamics, cultural background, and lots of other things. When parents are involved, they can reinforce the young person's emotional well-being, provide comfort, and help them navigate challenges more effectively. But sometimes we can't involve family. So there may be a time when it's not appropriate to involve parents, and it would not be appropriate because it might put the young person at risk. For example, a member of the family might have been involved in abusing the young person, and it would therefore not be appropriate to involve them when seeking to address the young person's needs. So this is very complex, very different for every young person and every young person's family. Sometimes you can involve the mother or the father in the family, one of the party. Sometimes it's probably better not to involve either of them. Every situation is different. Meeting a student's needs, checking referrals. So if we're looking to a professional to meet a student's needs, we should be looking at their qualifications, their training experience. Have they got access to a hospital clinic as required? Have they had previous involvement? What's the student's preference? What's the parent's preference? Does this person have a general reputation for achieving results, and particularly with working with young people? And can they communicate with young people? What's the cost? Is it covered by the student's health insurance? And do they use a strength-based approach? So there's lots of different things that we need to consider when considering what sort of person we're going to refer the young person to. For referrals, we must ensure the professional status of each person required to meet the need of the student. They must have be safe to work with children. So most professionals that are registered by professional organisations, this will automatically be a part of their registration. The residents and the parents have authorised a referral, and they've carried out due diligence to ensure the students will be safe. Meeting a student's needs, providing information. We need to provide information to professionals supporting the student. The information needs to be up to date and, the most current version of what we have. Meeting a student's needs, effective advocacy. This is an empowering and enabling process because this focuses on promoting a student's self-determination, autonomy and active participation in decision making that affects their lives, and it observes we must observe ethical standards in advocacy, including confidentiality, informed consent, non-discrimination, ensuring that advocacy efforts prioritise the best interests and rights of the young person being represented. If there has been a crisis or an incident, we need to debrief staff, need to identify any problems with the support, identify issues and problems experienced by colleagues, support colleagues with advice and assistance, identify counselling and PD needs of colleagues, and meeting a student's needs, the evaluation of that. So after we have gone through this whole process of identifying a student's needs and meeting the needs or supporting the student to have their needs met, how do we know if this has been effective or not? There can be internal reviews. So during or at the conclusion of a meeting, the needs of a particular student by the staff working in that residence, at the end of the term or end of the year review of services, a regular standing agenda item in the residence staff meeting. It can be an external review where a person or a team external to the team working at the residence may come in and review the programs offered by the residents. Supporting colleagues. It's important to support colleagues, to listen to colleagues and provide advice, particularly after incidents. Sometimes colleagues are going to need more support than at other times. Identify training or professional development opportunities for colleagues. Seeking feedback from young people, particularly about how we have met their needs or the support that they've received. Use youth-specific engagement principles, inclusivity, safe and supportive environment, youth-centred approach, meaningful engagement, clear and accessible communication, flexibility and creativity, feedback loop and transparency, recognition and appreciation. Advocacy for young people must be guided by the principles of empowerment and enabling. So it focuses on the young person's self-determination, autonomy and active participation in the decision-making process. This involves recognising and respecting the young person's right to make choices and decisions about their own lives within the organisation's policies and procedures. Self-evaluation. How do we self-evaluate? By requesting a formal appraisal, by seeking feedback and advice from managers and peers, by self-reflection, including journals. The last part of Unit 16-18 is about short-term counselling strategies, but we need to note this. Most boarding staff are not experienced or accredited for formal counselling roles, and it's inappropriate to be involved in formal counselling unless it's an agreed role or specifically requested. If a student required formal ongoing counselling, they should be referred to an accredited counsellor or psychologist. But all boarding staff will experience situations where they're required to use basic counselling skills. So this is not formal counselling, but it's just basic counselling skills where they're advising students or giving some directions for a student for an issue or a problem that is less serious. So we're going to look at short-term counselling strategies, and there's 9 of these. The first is listening, the second is empathy, third is being genuine, fourth is unconditional positive regard, the fifth is concreteness or being focused, the sixth is open questions, 7 is use of silence, 8 is interpretation, and 9 is removing obstacles to change. So let's just go back and unpack these. Okay, number 1 was listening. So that's like, we call this attending or listening. So we're listening to the content, what is specifically said, but also the non-verbal communication, including how content is conveyed, themes, body language, and interactions. So this is a short-term counselling strategy. And so we call it attending because you're actually fully focused on the person, you're attending to them, you're listening to them, to the content and the non-verbal communication. Empathy. So this again brings into this attending, non-verbal and verbal attending, paraphrasing, contents of communication, reflecting student feelings and implicit messages, so reflecting that back to the students. So that's a second short-term counselling strategy. Being genuine. This is the ability of the counsellor to be freely themselves and really genuine with the young person. Number 4 is unconditional positive regard, an expression of caring and acceptance by responding to the student's messages, verbal and non-verbal, with non-judgmental, non-critical and verbal and non-verbal reactions. So just that unconditional positive regard for the student. Concreteness, or being focused. Concreteness is keeping the conversation specific and focused on the facts, and bringing it back to being focused on the facts and the feelings of relevant concern. Open questions, number 6. This is using open question process. This will assist a student in clarifying or exploring thoughts or feelings. Number 7 is the use of silence. Silence in counselling, so it sounds odd, doesn't it? You think counselling, you're talking to a student, but the use of silence can give the student control of the content, the pace and the objectives. Number 8, interpretation. Interpretation is any statement by the counsellor to the student which goes beyond what the student has specifically said or is aware of. Number 9 is removing obstacles to change. Removing obstacles to change may involve supplying data, opinions, facts, resources, or answers to questions. Explore with the students possible problems which might delay or prevent their change process. In collaboration with the student, identify possible solutions and alternatives. But, this strategy seeks to remove any obstacles to the student changing. A couple of notes here. This is about short-term counselling strategies. Note 1, referring a student to formal counselling. If you're supporting a student and working with a student to meet their needs in short-term counselling, you may find you need to refer that person to a counsellor for formal training, and we talked about that before. The second note is after a short-term counselling session, even if it's an informal session with a young person, it may be useful to make notes which are a summary of that conversation and provide these notes to staff members who are supporting the student. So the last question, question 65, requires you to refer to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that's the website there. So if you take note of that, refer to that website and you'll be able to answer that question, question 65. So thank you very much for being a part of Unit 1618, the first part of the diploma. It's quite a long couple of units, but thank you very much for being a part of it.